you want to follow along as we get started on our learning, you're welcome to open to 384, 385, but you don't need one necessarily. I'm going to give us a little bit of context. I think I've taught enough years and enough on the Pesach story that perhaps if you have heard this scene setting from me before, but Pesach itself has at least three geological layers. Of course, geological layers start from the oldest being at the bottom and then go higher and higher and higher as time goes on. That's the sediment build, so to speak. So through the sands of time, the original Pesach experience at the bottom of that geological set of strata is what? What's the first layer? Right, putting blood on the door.
I'm sorry, are you talking about like throughout Jewish history?
Throughout Jewish history, the original.
1280-ish time period.
Right, so the original layer of Pesach, whenever we're celebrating, talking about, studying Pesach, is the original Pesach, the original Yetziat Mitzrayim, the original idea of leaving Egypt. That is theoretically the longest ago experienced layer of Pesach. What was the next level of Pesach? Just out of curiosity, what was the next way historically that the Jewish people, according to the Torah, then commemorated and took part in the rituals of Pesach? Pesach, very nice. The follow-up, the tashlu and the makeup Pesach, great. But over time, where were we celebrating and in what way were we celebrating Pesach in the next geological layer? We're in the wilderness, and where do we land eventually? According to this, eventually we'll be in a place where the way that we need to celebrate Pesach will be doing something, but I'll give you a hint, it wasn't a Seder. Pesach is one of three holidays that falls into this category. It's the idea of a pilgrimage, right? Of going up to the temple and making a sacrifice that was in memory of Pesach. And then I already cheated, or rather gave you a hint and told you the next layer up in commemoration of offerings that would have been in commemoration of the actual Exodus from Egypt. What's the most recent kind of layer? It's the Seder. It depends on which scholars you ask, but probably loosely based, ranging to very specifically based upon other ancient practices of symposia, this idea that you have a meal that has to it a Seder, an order, and that there are foods and courses that pertain to each of the different parts of the service. That's the Seder that we experience. I did just jump 1,000. It sounds like I jumped 1,000 years because I jumped 1,000 years. Often when we study Pesach and we talk about our experiences, we have in mind that top stratum. And the reason, I think, is because according to the last really global, actually not literally global, half global, the North American survey on the way that Jews participate in Jewish life, regardless of their affiliation or personal Jewish identity, the number one observance in 2001 was Seder. It wasn't even necessarily Hanukkah. I think that would have been my bet had I been asked to place bets. But ultimately Pesach is the holiday that most Jews experience. So when we talk about the language of Pesach and we go back and we read this original story, we're looking into the story through the eyes, understandably and beautifully, of what our Seder is. I'm going to try to cut through that a little bit with the reading of a particular word today, because I think it's interesting to watch a debate unfold over the years as to whether a verse means what it says it means or doesn't mean what it says it means. So let's set up the context. And then eventually, I promise you, we're going to get to a term that gets thrown around at Pesach that we use in a very different way and perhaps will change the way in which you observe Pesach. Sidebar, the funniest thing to me about this is that when I talk about Pesach, people think, oh my goodness, Pesach is coming, which is sort of true. But it's only sort of true because calendrically, one of the weirdest things that Jews do is that we wind up discussing Pesach in depth twice in a season, even when it falls so late like this, right? We're about to, as we were just discussing, we're about to enter the month of Shvat. We're not quite there to Pesach yet, but we're discussing on our Torah reading calendar cycle, we're there, right? In just a couple weeks, we'll be exiting and free from slavery, and we go back, so to speak, historically at Pesach. So no, my point was don't panic yet. Pesach isn't here yet. This isn't a pre-Pesach teaching. This is a Parshat Bo teaching. But I want us to get in the mindset of what some of this original language might have meant, because I think that's the source of the argument our rabbis set out to make. So context, if you're on in the Chumash, you're on 384, V'yom harishon mikra kodesh. God is explaining that we're going to have a holiday. Uvayom hashvi'i mikra kodesh yihyeh lechem. It's also going to be on the seventh day, a sacred occasion. Kol melechai lo ya'aseh vahem. You shouldn't do any of the labors that might be prohibited on a holiday like that. Ach, asher ye'achal lechol nefesh hu levado ya'aseh lechem. It's just what every person is supposed to eat on that occasion. That is the only thing that should be prepared for you on that occasion. A lot to dive into on that verse, but I want us to move to verse 17. Just wanted to let us have that little tidbit of context that we're talking in preparation for the Exodus, about how the Exodus will eventually be observed by our people. So we're already in the first celebration of Pesach, looking towards the way in which our people, God willing, upon freedom, will be able to look back and celebrate this occasion that they're being promised, that they're going to be let go and free. And we are commanded on that occasion as such in verse 17. Ushmartem et hamatzot, ki be'etzem hayom hazeh hotzeti et tzivotechem me'eretz Mitzrayim. So you shall... What's ushmartem? What's the root there? Shamar. Okay, and what can shamar? Shamar kind of means two major things. What do we think it means in this context? Keep, observe, like, what do we say about people who keep or observe Shabbat or Kashrut? Shomer, Shomrei, Shomeret, that they're guardians of. So, and you shall guard these matzot. What are the matzot? Just in case somebody was wondering. What's a matzah, according to them? Unleavened bread. It's the cakes that are reminiscent of the cakes that they'll be taking out of Egypt with them. They're going to watch the matzot because on this day, it was on the occasion of this day, in the midst of this day, you were taken out. I took out your ranks, your hosts from Egypt, Meretz Mitzrayim, ushmartem. Same verb, different verb. The same or different than earlier in the verse. Different trope, but same word, right? Ushmartem et hayom hazeh lidorotechem chukat olam. And you shall guard, what are we guarding now? Et hayom hazeh, this day, this occasion, for generations, it's going to be a chok, some sort of a law that is everlasting. Chok, everlasting. That's a Jewish version. So that's in plain contextual sense, we have two commands to guard something in this verse. Let's quickly review. The first thing that we're guarding in the verse is ushmartem et ha-matzot. You're guarding the unleavened cakes. And then we have ushmartem et hayom hazeh. We're also guarding the day and the occasion. Okay. When is Rashi? I went in rough calendrical order with these sources, even though there are a lot. When is Rashi? 11th to 13th century. I'm part of the camp that believes it's like Shakespeare, like it was a school of people, because the commentary seems to span maybe even centuries. Rashi has a comment on this. So it's just on that little piska, that little bit ushmartem et hamatzot, that first ushmartem. The Rashi says, shelo yavo lidei chimutz, that it shall not pass over to lidei, let's say to the state of, but literally it's interesting in this occasion, lidei is like to the hands of, and it pertains to the image, right? It fits with the image of what we're about to create, since we're talking about the dough of bread. And how do you handle dough? With your hands. So lidei, it's a little bit poetic. It's a little bit lyrical. Shelo yavo lidei chimutz. And what's chimutz? Chametz. What's chimutz if you're just an Israeli on the street? Interesting. What is that related to? What is that word most used for in the grocery store in 2025? Pickles. Thank you so much, Rabbi Klickfeld. It's used for pickles, right? It's used so that idea is twofold. Chamutz is the description of what I would say that all these things have in common the idea of souring. And souring is something that in English also we see expansively as a word, because we picture something having soured as having turned from one state to another state. So it's interesting because chametz, we know as chametz, as in it's gotten into the category of foods which we are forbidden to eat because they've been given time to rise, but it's specifically saying that it shouldn't be given over to the state of turning to chimutz. I want us to kind of linger on that word. Mikan amru, tafach tiltosh betzonen. I do not have time to get into this deeply today, but this is an amazing phrase that another time we should study in deeply. What this is in reference to is a Mishnaic and then later a Talmudic phrase that says that she should go ahead and add in some, should polish by adding cold water to the dough. Why would someone need to add cold water to matzah dough? Maybe people here are bakers? To stop it from rising. It is a surprisingly liberal deep dive down what matzah and what made matzah kosher once upon a time. At one very far end of the spectrum, you have a simple phrase shared by the rabbis of our Mishnah that if all of a sudden you're dealing with the dough of matzah and it starts to seem to turn towards chimutz, you should add cold water and you can polish the dough as such in order to keep it from rising. Does this sound like something we would do today? Yeah. I would say that we're in our strict era when it comes to matzot, and we're going to lean into that idea. We would generally not simply go ahead and add anything because the precision of measurements that we use, both in ingredients and in time, is considered very, very tight in terms of the kashrut. Right, so Brant points out is that it implies that this rose a little bit. With Pesach, you don't want it to rise at all. So in the context of this verse, it seems like they're doing what they're supposed to do, which is to stop the bread from rising. They're disrupting the chemical process, whatever might be taking place. Rabbi Yeshua comes in with a teaching that now, remember, Rashi is bringing in the 11th to 13th centuries, and he teaches as follows. Omer, al tehi kore et hamatzot. Don't read this verse as matzot, ella et ha mitzvot. What is he saying? Don't read this as matzot, rather read it as mitzvot. What does that mean, literally?
Don't read the word as matzot, read it as commandment.
How would it be possible to read this word as mitzvot instead of as matzot? Hebrew's not pointed, right? And is it possible, looking at this word, when you look at it, you see the bolded, unpointillated, non-nikud text at the beginning of the Rashi, Ushmartem et, could you read that as a hamitzvot? Could you look at it sideways and upside down and think maybe a Torah reader could make a mistake that way? Okay, so it's not a huge stretch. It's important to know that this is just a itsy-bitsy stretch on the word. He says, don't read it as hamitzvot. Kederech she'ein machamitzin et hamatzah, in the way that we do not want to have any sort of, let's call it souring, chamitzing of a matzah, of a what's the word I'm looking for? Cake of unleavened dough. Kach ein machamitzin et hamitzvah. Just as such, we don't want to machamitzin et hamitzvah. What could that mean? What's machlitzin et ha-mitzvah? Machlitzin, we said, means something along the lines of pickled, soured. Machlitzin et ha-mitzvah.
Don't stew over it for a long time.
Don't stew over it for a long time. Okay, like that take, Mark. Do you have a take?
Don't let it get away.
Don't let it get away.
Do it timely.
Don't lose the opportunity.
Don't lose the opportunity. Do it in a timely fashion. Okay, because it might start to turn and you want to catch it, like this image of, oh, let's stop with a little cold water and polishing the dough. Don't let a mitzvah run away. Ela im ba'a liyadcha aseh otach miyad. Rather, if it comes directly into your hand, you should immediately do it. The it being the mitzvah. Okay. I'm not going to say much more because I could dive down further, but I want us to see how this takes off in the source work. Take a look at Ibn Ezra below this. Ibn Ezra is going to be a little bit more of a literalist. Hine tziva lihyot hamatzot shmurim miyamot hakatzir. Behold, we have this commandment that the matzahs themselves are supposed to be shmurim. Pause on that word. What's shmura matzah?
That's watched over at all times, from the beginning of the process through the end.
So it's watched matzah. In our house at Seder, we put it on the table, go, okay, don't take your eyes off this box. It's watched matzah, right? It's going to be guarded matzah. It's guarded matzah. And even going back to the time of Ibn Ezra, what guardianship means is from the time of the katsir. What does that mean? Even from harvesting the grain that's intended for the matzot, you should be watching over it so carefully. You should be watching over it so carefully that what? It doesn't start to leaven. You have to make sure that it preciously doesn't get anything wet on it, or it doesn't start to churn. That idea goes way, way back several centuries.
Attention to detail, which is interesting, because they didn't have watches to count the minutes, but you have to pay constant attention to detail if you're going to be making this matzah. That's what this is showing, that it's its own version of 18 minutes without a watch.
Great. So as Brant points out, in a time before pocket watches, nowadays our version of being extremely careful and precise is to set a timer in that from the time that we do mixing of the dough until the time that dough goes in the oven. That's the precision that we strive for in let's call it stam kasher matzot, like just plain old kosher matzah, factory or handmade. We want to be very careful with that time. This is a different version of extra guardianship and care, watching very carefully. Sforno, skipping ahead to the 15th century. Can someone read for us Sforno? You can read it in the English if you'd like to. Someone want to volunteer to read it? Okay, thanks, Alan.
Ushmartem et ha-mitzvot, hamatzot, which are called such to reflect the speed with which they have been baked without giving the dough a chance to ferment and rise.
Great. Thank you for being our demonstrator of how easy it is to read that word one way or another. Right. So when Sforno's talking about the plain meaning of this verse and this idea of the cakes, Sforno's pointing out they're called shmur. They're called as such. These ushmartan. They're called that because they are they reflect the speed that has been given, the attention that's been given in order not to allow for them to rise in that place. The Chizkuni takes this in a slightly different direction. Does someone want to read the Chizkuni out loud?
Ushmartem et hamatzot. You shall observe the commandment to eat unleavened bread on these days for the future. We find this formulation being used in this sense also in Numbers 28:2 in connection with the daily communal offering, where the Torah writes, make sure that you offer it at the time appointed for it.
Great. Thank you for reading that out loud in here. My question is, what does Sforno think is being guarded, and what does Chizkuni think is being guarded? If we go back to the Sforno for a moment, what is being guarded?
The dough.
The dough, literally the dough. We're guarding the dough. It's our command to guard the dough. Okay. And what does the Chizkuni think that we're guarding? The commandment and the day. But interestingly, and I didn't get an opportunity to go back to my either Mikro Godolot or another compendium to see if this might be sort of a anachronism or a mistake on Sfaria, but notice what's the hook on which this rests? Is it on the first part of the verse that we read or the second? Ushmartem et hamatzot, and we have ushmartem a second time. Ushmartem et hayom hazeh. That's later in the verse.
About the daily sacrifice.
Right, which is talking about the daily sacrifice, which is a way of not watching over the actual loaves or the bread or the dough itself,
Careful about when you offer the sacrifice.
being careful about when you offer the sacrifice, which is another way of observing or being careful with the day. To the Orach Chaim, anyone want to read that out loud? In the English or in the Hebrew? The Orach Chaim is the third source on the second page or the back half of the first page. If not, I'll read it. But I like hearing your voices.
You shall guard the unleavened bread, etc. God told us that just as he had carefully guarded that day, and had not redeemed us a single day later than the timetable he had planned, so we should be careful not to allow the dough for the unleavened bread to remain inactive for a minute too long. Otherwise, it might begin to rise.
Okay. So Sforno thinks that the thing that we should be paying attention to in Ushmartem are the cakes of dough themselves. A little bit of a literalist. Chorny says all of this stuff, including the stuff around guarding the matzot, is a concern for observing the day. The Orach Chaim twists this a bit and says that the Perush is Kashem she'ani shamarti hayom v'lo acharti yom echad uve'etzam hayom hazeh hotzeti etchem l'tam zeh. It's that just like I, who's I speaking in this verse, just as I, God, God's self, did not tarry. I'm going to use that fancy English word. I didn't chimutz. I didn't pickle one day on going to rescue, which, by the way, I take some issue with that idea that God didn't pickle a little bit waiting for us to be rescued. But just like I didn't wait even a little bit, so too what?
You need to be careful in doing it immediately and at the appointed time.
This is our intentionality when we're watching the dough, is that we should be thinking about how God didn't even wait a moment. Again, interesting read on the original text, but God did not even tarry one day. We're going to take a look at two last sources. I'm blazing through here because I want us to be Shomrei Motzei Shabbat. So I want to take a look at these last two sources. And again, this back and forth on what exactly we're guarding. A Rabbeinu Bachia reader, anyone from among the crowd? Yes, Rosa, go ahead. Read nice and loud.
Guard the unleavened bread from the time it is being harvested against it becoming moist. You are to watch it again at the time of kneading the dough so that it will not become hametz. Our sages, Nechilta 9, read the word hamatzot as if it had been both spelled with the vowel patach under the letter mem, and had again been spelled with the vowel chirik under the letter mem. The message is that just as one does not let a commandment, mitzvah, become sour through procrastinating in its performance, so one must not allow the dough for the unleavened bread to stand around too long for the same reason.
So which of these two reads, according to Rabbeinu Bachia, should we be taking on this verse? Is it Ushmartem et hamatzot or et hamitzvot? Both. Rabbeinu Bachia is why not both? Says, actually, there are some times in the Torah where when we're reading a word, the vowels get in the way of the duality of the meaning that we could derive. And I'll have us read this last source, but I would feel Dayenu, haha, Pesach reference. I would feel like I had gotten enough out of this teaching just on this small point alone.
Their matzah nowadays. Most of it, I've almost remembered buying it from a
Great question, Rosa. I would love to talk about matzah making sometime. It is possible, and more people are artisanal about it. But I want to hang on this particular notion of being able to read a verse and specifically a word two ways at the same time. It's almost as if the vowels adulterate for us what could be a dual meaning in this verse. That changes the way that I even think about Kriyat Torah and this idea of coming up and the audacity that we have in reading. Any thoughts on that audacious double reading, or should we go to that final verse? When did the vowels come into use? An agreed upon system of vowel usage is about 500 to 600 years old. The pointillation goes back much earlier than that, but there's a much more agreed upon system that starts about 600 years ago. So it's relatively recent history. Let's look at that final verse and then we'll go to Birkat Hamazon. Mishnah Torah. Actually, and then we'll peek at one other idea right before we leave. Mishnah Torah. So Mishnah Torah says, Ushmartem et hamatzot. By the way, who's Mishnah Torah? Who's our author? Rambam. Thank you. Making sure we knew. Maimonides teaches us the following. Mishum shene'amar ishmartem et hamatzot kilomar hizaharu bamatzah v'shimru ota mikol tzad chimutz. He says, watch over the matzah means watch over the matzah. Don't let them be chametz. Lefichach amru chachamim sarich adam lizaher b'dagan she'ochel mimenu b'pesach shelo yavo alav mayim achar sheniktsar ad shelo yihye bo shum chimutz. So that means that our chachamim, our sages, said that people have to be very careful regarding what it is they go about eating on Pesach, specifically the grain, to make sure that it has not come into contact with what? Water, because that's the thing that sours it. Okay. Dagan shenit ba benahar o shenafal alav mayim kishem she'asur leochlo kach asur lekaimo ela mochro liyisrael umodio kedei sheyochlenu kodem ha-pesach. So grain that had these accidents, I guess they sunk in a river, it came into contact with water, it's forbidden to even eat it, it's forbidden even to be in possession of it on Pesach. Ve'im mecharo lenochri kodem ha-pesach mocher me'at lechol echad ve'echad kedei sheyichle kodem ha-pesach shema yachzor hanochri v'yimkerenu liyisrael. But if they sell it to a non-Jewish person if he sells it to a non-Jew before Pesach, he should sell it to a small group of people so that it would be finished before Pesach, just in case they were to sell it to a non-Jewish person and they would go and turn around and sell it to another Jewish person. Rather than diving deep into this, since this is the siyum of our learning, what would you say the great concern is by the time of Rambam about what it is that we're guarding? Jews not eating chametz, no unadulterated matzah, no unadulterated bread whatsoever. The latest sources that we have move us entirely away from the connection, this duality in our verse, these two ushmartems, so there are two dualities in our verse, and I'll close on this. The two dualities are that in the verse itself, the plain verse, chapter 12, verse 17, we have two ushmartems, and they are equal in weight in the verse itself, both to guard the matzot themselves and also to guard the day, the customs of it and the observances of it. And there's another duality present in the non-nikud version of the word itself, that we can read matzot and mitzvot in one breath. So as we go through reading this first version of the story, and we maybe even begin to think about what we want to say at our Seder tables, I encourage us not to lose that sense of duality about what it is that we're guarding. It is very, very easy to slip into the notion that the one thing that we're guarding is how many minutes we mix the dough or how carefully little drops of water felt on the grains. But there is a story to guard as well overall.